Welcome back. Whether you're joining us through video or if you're listening to the audio on the podcast, we welcome you. We're kicking off a series all about adoption, and we're going to dive into the hard stuff and the good stuff. And we are not entering this series in a simple way. We've got a pretty complex topic right out of the gate. So I am excited to invite my guest, Rita Soronen, today to the table to talk about adoption from foster care, what matching means, effective matching, that process, what goes into that, both the experience of adoptive families trying to sort that out, but also what happens in the background by agencies that contribute to establishing how a good match, or how we believe good matches happen, and how we go about doing those. And so, Rita is the president and CEO of the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption. For more than 30 years, she has worked on behalf of abused, neglected, and vulnerable kids, providing leadership for local, state, and national efforts working to improve both the juvenile justice system and child welfare systems, while striving to assure the permanent homes for North America's children. She is the CEO and president of Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, both in the US and in Canada, a national nonprofit public charity. They work to find adoptive families for more than 150,000 children waiting in North America's foster care systems. Under her leadership, the foundation dedicated more than $40.9 million to grants and award winning programs such as Wendy's Wonderful Kids, which you might be familiar with, Adoption Friendly Workplace, and National Adoption Day, and is building awareness around growing need for foster care adoption. Since 2005, the Wendy's Wonderful Kids program has grown from 7 pilot sites to more than 475 sites across the US and Canada. This program's evidence based model is dedicated to moving those children most at risk of aging out of foster care into permanent families. In 2011, independent research results of the Wendy's Wonderful Kids demonstrated that children referred to that program are up to 3 times more likely to be adopted. More than 10,000 children have been adopted as a result of Wendy's Wonderful Kids. I could not feel more privileged to have today's conversation with Rita. Rita, thank you so much. It's my joy to have you here today to talk about fostering, adoption, and matching factors. So I'm just wondering if I've got 4 main questions for you today, but before we begin, because I don't think a lot of people know the Wendy's Wonderful Kids program, would you mind
Sure.
starting with a bit of an overview about why it started and what the work looks like for that program?
Absolutely. And thank you for this conversation today. I've
Yeah.
been looking forward to it. So, the Wendy's Wonderful Kids program is a signature effort of the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption. And the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption is a nonprofit public charity in both the United States and Canada that works to dramatically increase the adoptions of children out of North America's foster care systems. So, a number of years ago, in fact, back in 2002, 2003, we really began to assess where could we be value added in the foster care adoption space. We were doing a lot of good public awareness campaigns at that point, trying to talk about the fact that children are in foster care waiting to be
Yeah.
adopted and that it is one option for families. But we were finding that children continued at alarming rates to age out of the foster care system.
Yes. Yeah.
So that was perhaps the space that we could begin to dedicate our resources and time among continuing, in addition to continuing to raise awareness.
Yeah.
And so we looked at what were the emerging best practices across North America for social workers, caseworkers to really focus on this population of children that are most at risk of aging out of care. And for us, that was children age 9 and older, children in sibling groups,
Yeah.
children and youth with special needs, and those youth who have been in care for so long, perhaps, that they've given up on
Yeah.
themselves and the notion of family and permanency.
Mm.
And they still suffer from issues, of course, ongoing issues of grief and loss and not wanting to appear disloyal to their biological family. So they resist efforts at permanency
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
we found that there were some emerging best practices, but there was nothing at an evidence based level. So we pulled together this program that we called Wendy's Wonderful Kids because one of our largest philanthropic partners at the time and still is the Wendy's system, Wendy's
Okay.
franchisees and suppliers who fundraise for both the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption US and Canada in order to implement programs. So we called it Wendy's Wonderful Kids. They increased their fundraising. We developed this model that said, really it's just good social work. Let's give grants to organizations, large or small, public or private, who are willing to implement this model that we're testing that says by hiring a full-time adoption professional with the grant from the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, the recruiter that we called it, a Wendy's Wonderful Kids recruiter, could carry a smaller caseload of children. So 12 to 15 total, as opposed to the 40 or 50
Right.
sometimes that caseworkers were
Okay.
carrying. And by doing that, they could focus on the child's unique journey through foster care, their background, do a deep dive into the case file, and find potential adoptive resources that are in that case file, from former foster families to extended family members. Stick with the child, help them understand the value of
Yeah.
permanency, work with the potential families that step forward, and help them understand the journey that this child has gone through, their unique needs, wishes, and hopes, and then hopefully make these matches work and then stay with them to the point of permanency and frequently post permanency. So we began a pilot launch in 2004 in 7 US sites and in 2006 in Canada, and began to test this and see if it would work. And we found very quickly that adoptions were finalizing, that families were coming together. And I think, in all honesty, it's because it works and we took it through a rigorous 5-year evaluation and we know at an evidence based level it
Yeah.
works. But it also works because these are the children that no one was focusing on.
Yes.
They were simply
Yeah.
calling them
They fell
unadoptable.
through the cracks.
They
Yeah.
they fell
Yeah.
through the cracks, and professional social workers, even the best of them, felt, well, if we can just get them to that 18 or 21 or 23 age and help them get out of the system, then we've
That's
done
right.
our
Yeah.
job, when really permanency is the
Right.
job. So that's
Oh,
been the
crazy.
evolution, both from identifying a gap,
Yeah.
committing resources, engaging partners, and testing it, making sure at an evidence-based level it works, and then continuing to grow it at a profound level.
I can only imagine the quality of the experience skyrocketing if a caseload goes from 40 to 12. I just
Yes.
can't, I could not fathom the difference. Having been kind of in a government system for 20 years and watching
Yep.
social work run its wheels, I just can't imagine how big of a change that would be. These are humans we're dealing with. You
Yes.
can't rush these
Exactly.
processes, and we need to be with our kids in the nitty gritty of it so they're not
Yes.
alone figuring out the details. Yeah, incredible. Our main
Exactly.
topic today is going to be about matching factors, but I did want to ask you something before we dive into that.
Sure.
Your scope of practice in your career is incredible. And I know that you have tapped a lot of different organizations and done a lot of differing work within this realm or under the umbrella of fostering and adoption
Yes.
and vulnerable kids. I'm increasingly, as an adoptive parent, but also as somebody who supports adoptive parents, I'm increasingly aware of the adoptee's voice and adult adoptees really shedding a lot of light on their own desire and longing to have had better better resources put toward permanency of their own biofamilies. And so
Yeah.
family preservation resources in our
Yes.
countries rather than the tail end of we're so far into the system now we're kind of trying to rescue the system,
Yes.
right? Or kids out of the
Yes.
system. And I know that the work you're currently doing is more on the other end of the spectrum,
Yeah.
but that your history has really tapped all parts of the timeline of where kids leave families and come into families. And I'm curious, just from your expertise and your perspective and your learning, where you see the role of prevention.
It's critical.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think across North America we've if not ignored, we've at least minimized, because we hear stories of, horrible abuse or horrible
Yeah.
neglect of a child or the death of a child, and we all want to rush in and make sure that that doesn't happen to any child. But you're right, that's the back end. The front end is, we children deserve and belong in their families of origin.
Yeah.
They deserve to be there and they belong there.
Yeah.
And we as communities must apply every effort and resource to make sure that families can be resource rich, full of support and connectedness, so that they can raise families to the best of their ability and children can thrive in those families.
Yeah.
And frequently, issues of poverty or lack of resources or unemployment or those kinds of things creep into a child welfare system, when it's really an entirely different conversation. How do we support families if this is an issue of poverty, or
Yes.
this is an issue of a child not being able to get to school because
Yeah.
mom or dad can't, you know, manage to find a way to get them to school or
Right.
take a day off from work in order to help them get
Yeah.
there. So that gets conflagrated, unfortunately, into that neglect
Yeah.
conversation, which can be critical for a child.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We want to make sure that children have all the human needs, food and shelter and safety, in order to thrive. And if those don't exist, one, how can we support that family?
Yes.
If that doesn't work, if that child remains unsafe
Yeah.
or unable to thrive, then we can engage the child welfare system. But we miss that upfront piece by providing and helping with those resources, and default too quickly, much too quickly, to a child welfare system.
Yeah.
Combined with that, of course, and again across North America, we have a deep divide in terms of racial
Yes.
equity.
Marginalized
Um,
folks. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
marginalized families. And so we're quick to leap to, this is what I believe is a viable
Yeah.
family, versus I understand the culture that I'm dealing with in a different way. And so there's certainly a long horrible history in both
Yeah.
countries
Yeah.
about not taking care of families of different cultures in a way, or respecting that culture in a way that, again, or just stealing children out of those
Yeah.
families, that drove legacies of children into the child welfare system. So we have to grapple with both of
Yeah.
those, but we certainly have to first default to prevention, not first default to removal.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that perspective, and I think we love simple answers. So we'd love to eradicate the
Yeah.
system, and we'd love to go in that direction when we really see and understand the grief that's involved when we can't avoid that system. But
Yes.
the reality is we are working today. We have a both and situation. Um,
Yes.
but it doesn't give us license to ignore change. So we're wanting to
Exactly.
resource, right? To be able to grow that end of the spectrum rather than just say, well, it's too late. We're in it, right? It's a both and. I
Exactly.
appreciate that. Thank you.
Exactly.
Um,
Well, then that,
yeah.
that very particular personal identity that children have,
Yeah,
where they came from, is their identity. And when we rip that away from them, we have to do it consciously.
that's right. Well, and we won't probably get into this today, but there are so many in between factors that we can do to support on that continuum.
Yes.
So, how
Yes.
do we foster cultural growth in families that they weren't prepared for, or how do we keep kids connected to their biofamily in an open, safe
Yes.
way wherever possible? How do we
Yes.
remove the fear factors that a lot of adoptive families come into this, and remove some of the myths around what they believe is going to be happening if they have to stay connected to birth family?
Exactly.
So if we can
Exactly.
do that work, that is all toward the avenue, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So when we talk about matching factors, I think about
Mm.
how complicated and I don't even know what the word is, but it provokes a
Mm.
lot of anxiety for
Yeah.
adoptive families who are waiting, who are curious about how this is going to unfold. They don't have the magic 8 ball that's going to tell them who their match will be. They
Yeah.
know desperately they are longing to grow their family. And I think there's a two-sided piece to this. Agencies have responsibility to do really good practice around matching factors. So they have the
Yes.
research end of it. And then there's families' experiences, adoptive families who are trying to fill out forms and say what they feel capable of and what risk factors will we accept. And it's so
Yes.
hard when you don't have a child to evaluate the match with. You just have a concept, right? And you have a form to tick boxes off. And it
Mm,
feels so heavy. It's such a big responsibility not knowing what the outcome's going to be. So, can you
mm.
walk us through some of the things a program or an agency might be considering, what they've learned along the way matters for a solid match, and maybe some of the things to identify what families go through?
Sure, and it is an awesome responsibility on both
Yeah.
sides of the coin,
Yeah.
and one that no one obviously can or should take
Yeah.
lightly. I'll start with families that are thinking about jumping into the foster care system. Uh, the best and first thing to do is really do a deep self assessment.
Mm.
What's good for me? What's good for my family? What is it that we can accommodate in terms of needs of a child, age, number of siblings, and be brutally honest
Yeah.
that indeed, I think people, we know from research that we do that people jump into the child welfare system to adopt, not only because they want to expand or create a family, but because they have a sense of altruism, that they want to help a
Yeah.
child. And so scrutinizing what about me wants to help this
Mm.
child? Is it for me or is it for the child? And both are valid. But within that, will I accept an older child? Am I interested in bringing an adolescent into this family? Am I interested in bringing an infant into this family? Could I accommodate siblings? Because frequently someone will get into the foster care system and they'll find, oh, I'm quite attracted to the profile of this child, but that child also has a sibling. Am
Yes.
I willing to bring siblings in together? Um, do I have the kind of supports around me that will accept a foster care child into my family?
Mm.
Does my extended family believe that this is a
Yeah.
viable route for
Absolutely. That
my
matters.
family?
Yeah.
Absolutely matters, because if I feel like I'm going to get judgment or negative judgment from my external sources, how much do I want to accommodate that?
Yeah.
Or the reverse is, can I engage a robust network of support around
Yeah.
me? Do I have access to the kind of resources and understand the kind of resources that it might
Mm.
take if I bring in a child that has experienced layers of trauma by being
Right. The
removed from
complexity.
their biological
Yeah.
family?
Yeah.
Absolutely. If they've moved multiple times while they've been
Yeah.
in care, they've been in different schools, that all builds on a child's sense of security and self. And it may not be evident at the first point of adoption, but it
Mhm.
may surface later on. So, do I understand that reaching out and asking for assistance, do I know where to reach out and ask for assistance first of all? But do I understand that it's okay to do that, that it's not a failure on my
Yeah. Yeah.
part? I would do the same for any child. So really doing that internal scrutiny of what is it that I believe can be a healthy and thriving approach to bringing a child from foster care into my family permanently.
Yeah.
And that word permanently is critical.
Yes.
This isn't a test.
No.
This
A
isn't
trial.
a
That's
trial.
right.
This
A
is
child.
forever,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And really, and it's okay if at any point in that self assessment I say, you know what, not right now,
Yeah.
or this is exactly what I will. I couldn't possibly handle bringing a 16-year-old into my family, and so making sure that you're willing to be your own best advocate in talking with the agency and saying, here's what I need, here's what I want. I'll certainly stay open to conversations
Yeah.
and to alternative conversations and options. But as of right now, this is what I need.
Yeah.
And then the agents, from the agency point of view, really looking at families that step forward and making sure that they understand all of those things we just talked
Mhm.
about, but in reverse, really. Does the family understand that this is forever, that this is a permanent commitment? Do they understand that they can and should be able to network out for resources,
Yeah.
that they should be able to come back to us for questions, that they maintain an open relationship with us and understand that at times it gets
Yeah.
frustrating. It can be very frustrating to deal with government
Mhm.
systems, particularly now with workforce
Yeah.
issues and phone calls and virtual communication. Does this family appear to be willing to embark on this very complex journey with a government system and stay open and positive and willing to take education and advice and create the kind of learning that's necessary. And is this family willing to, if it's at all possible, keep connections with the child's
Yeah.
biological
Yeah.
family? Obviously, at point of permanency, it's up to the adoptive family to make that
Right.
decision, but it is frequently best for the child to
Yes.
maintain those biological connections, even if the adoptive family feels insecure or
Yeah.
uncomfortable with that. It's always about safety, of
Yeah.
course, and it's always about the legal right of the adoptive family to
Yeah.
make those decisions. But keeping an open mind to and a lack of judgment about the child's extended
Yes.
biological
Oh, it's
family.
so huge. Yeah.
So I think it's those kinds of it's that balance between agency and potential adoptive
Yeah.
family, of really creating a dance of how we interact with each other, of understanding each other, and we always tell families if you don't feel comfortable with an agency with whom you've connected, for any reason,
Yeah.
maybe make a pause, explore other agencies, make yourself comfortable,
Right.
but stay open to the fact that the agency may be going through challenges of workforce issues or
Yeah.
pandemic
Right.
issues or something like that as
Yeah.
well.
I imagine the transparency of the conversation has to be there between parents and the agency, and how tricky that can feel. It's
Mm,
so vulnerable.
yes.
And I know a lot of parents, when the authority piece and the that's removed. So if I'm as a therapist meeting with prospective adoptive families, they will often say, "I don't dare to bring up with my social worker that
Mm,
I'm scared of that." Or
yeah.
what if that, or if I make it too narrow, if I say, if I'm too assertive about what I'm really comfortable with, are they going to rule me out for options that,
Sure.
and, I'm often asking people to practice language for how do you go back to the social worker and say what you just told me? How do you make it safe enough to be able to
Yes.
say, I'm uncertain about the boundary here. Can you keep me in the loop? But please also know and have a realistic expectation that that's probably something I'll be uncomfortable with, but I still want you to know
Yes.
about it. And, I think the weight of the pressure to say, I already know in advance of seeing a child or knowing or building a relationship with a child what I can and cannot handle is an
Mhm.
impossible question to
Yeah.
really accurately nail down, right? You can't
Yeah.
be specific. So
Yeah.
for parents to feel like it's okay to not know and to communicate that. And my hope is that agencies are really tuned in to how tricky and vulnerable that is so that they can be sensitive toward and non-judgmental toward people who are bringing those things up. Because
Exactly.
it's at the end of the day, both people are offering, with most transparency and open communication, the best outcome for the child. It's not selfish to say, I don't think I can handle something, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Nor is it an admission of failure at all.
No.
In
Yeah.
fact, we celebrate it when people are that
Yeah.
honest, and have done that kind of scrutiny, or have a sometimes it's a knee jerk reaction, and so you have to back up a little
Yeah.
bit and think about it. But ultimately, if that's the feeling in place, then
We
yes,
honor that. We
absolutely,
have to honor that.
yes,
Right.
yes.
One of the things that you are so passionate about is dispelling
Mhm.
myths about
Mhm.
fostering to adoption. So, most of our episodes around adoption are through private sources. So, not
Yeah.
necessarily from a government agency or through foster care, which is why we were extra excited to have you on today because of your wealth of knowledge in this particular area. Can you tell us what some of the myths are out there that you hear that are common, and maybe knock a few down for us and take them out of the picture? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
And I was looking over at a sheet because I want to get this right.
Yeah.
Every few years, we do a survey of American and Canadians' attitudes toward foster care
Oh,
and foster care adoption. And some of the questions we ask get at that, some of the misperceptions that exist. And one of them is 53% of Canadians believe that if they attempt to adopt out of foster care, that at some point the birth parents will try to come back and claim that child. That's majority of parents, potential parents,
wow.
believe that, and so they self-select out of the process, or they're very anxious in the process.
Okay.
And we want to make sure that people understand, and it's actually higher in the U.S. 76% of families
Wow.
believe
I didn't know it was
that
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 high.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. This was about 4 years ago. We're
Yeah.
due to have a new update on this.
Yeah.
But the reality is that these are final legal processes. When a child is available for adoption, the biological parents cannot ever contest it in court, come back and try and claim these children. Again, as we've already talked about, it may be best for the child to have continuing connections with extended family, but that's entirely up to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
adoptive family. The bio families cannot come back and try to legally
Right.
reclaim
Custody
these
and
children.
say and okay.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So that's the first
Okay.
one, I think. The second one is that it's much too expensive, right? It's much too expensive to adopt, and so I'm going to self-select out. Again, I always am a little bit challenged talking about this because what I don't want to do is demean the worth of a child in foster
Yeah,
care.
absolutely.
But when you compare the cost of, for example, an international adoption or a private infant adoption, they can be much more expensive because there are different fees for agencies and attorneys and transportation potentially and support of a birth
Yes.
family
Yeah.
or birth parent potentially.
Yeah.
So that makes it an expensive financial endeavor to adopt out of foster care. Those fees, those costs are essentially covered by the custodial
Yeah.
agency. So although yes, it is expensive to raise children in either country
Yes.
these
Yeah.
days, that cost of adoption is minimized for children out of foster
Yeah.
care. So if someone is balancing um, the kinds of adoption and cost is a primary factor,
Yeah.
that's something simply to consider.
Yeah.
The one that keeps me up, I will be honest with you, at night is this perception about who these children are. And again, I'm going to look at my
Oh,
sheet. At the last survey, 50% of Canadians
yeah.
believe that children are in foster care because they've done something wrong, because they're juvenile
Oh,
delinquents. And it's still just about the same in the US as well. So we bring cause from our misperception, we believe that the child is at fault.
oh.
That's why they're in foster care. And
Wow. We have
so
a lot of work to
that
do
just
there. Oh my goodness.
we
I
do,
did not know
and we
that.
do, yeah. And
Okay.
that compounds when you look at, for example, a 16-year-old Black child in the child
Uh-huh.
welfare system, right? We already bring perhaps our own
Assumptions.
biases and
Yes.
misperceptions and
Absolutely.
assumptions about culture or about age or about gender.
Yep.
And so we immediately say, well, that child is there because he or she deserves to be there, when nothing could be
No.
further from the truth. They're there through no fault of their
Yeah.
own. And so that's one of those biggest and that's why children tend to age out of foster care too, because look, go to any gathering where people are talking about their teenagers at home and what happens to
Uh-huh.
people's
Yeah.
faces, right? They screw up and we roll our
These
eyes
are
and
teenagers.
we all they're
Yes.
teenagers and we all have our stories about them. So adolescents are difficult creatures to begin with
Yes.
for the right reasons.
Yes.
It's a
That's
developmental
right.
phase. But add to that layers of trauma, issues of abuse and
Yeah.
neglect, issues of removal and grief and loss. And we might have a challenging 16-year-old in the foster care system, but it's not because they've done something
That's
wrong.
right.
And so we have to get over that notion of who these children are and what they deserve. They won't necessarily be fine if they just turn 18 or 21
No.
and leave the system and they can pull themselves up by their
Oh my
bootstraps
goodness.
because they're
Yeah.
survivors. We
Mm.
shouldn't put children in that
Right.
position. Indeed, many do fine, and they do go
Yeah,
on to
because they
become
have
thriving
to.
adults
Yes, right. Yeah,
because they
it's
have to.
not
But we shouldn't
fair.
put them in
Yeah.
that position. So those are some of those key misperceptions that we want to get over, that we want to work and make sure folks understand and appreciate and value the notion of childhood and the notion of vulnerability that children bring to the table,
Yeah.
and that they're not there because they're too expensive or because they're too old or because they've done something wrong. They're there because someone has done harm to them, and our job is to make sure that they can be safe in a permanent family.
Yeah, I'm glad that in another episode we're going to have a social worker on talking from an
Mm.
agency, adoption agency, talking about post-adoptive support, because that
Yes.
I know that varies from province to province, state to state, potentially, but
Mm.
um, when you adopt from foster care, you aren't it is not the same as private adoption in that sense either, that you do have some potential access to a
Yes.
pot of money that will help navigate very specific resources that you might need. So if your child comes with high complex needs, there are resources available there's money that can be funneled to you as a result of post-adoptive support. And yeah,
Exactly.
and that I don't think a lot of people know that going in when they're first investigating the idea of, can I, should I, do I feel capable of adopting, and then which route do I take? I think at that stage of the game, most people don't know the differences on the other side of actually permanence, and which
Yes.
system you go through, and what that can look like for families. Yeah.
Yes. And it can still be challenging, but I think
Oh
it is
yeah.
the one
Yeah.
among many recognitions that governments have made that if we are going to make appropriate matches for these children and move them into permanent families, there is also a critical need for post adoption resources. And so those
Yeah.
dollars do flow. Again, is it always enough? Not
No,
necessarily.
no.
But in terms of healthcare and education
Yeah.
and just daily support, it is there.
Yeah. And I would encourage parents who are thinking about this or going this route to ask while you're in the waiting process.
Yes.
Don't wait to find out afterwards. If that's something you're curious about, it's okay to ask. What would this look like? What would be available if this child requires a heavy amount of learning support, for instance? Or yeah. Okay.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because it is so complex and it does differ everywhere. That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Build your catalog of resources before finalization.
Yeah.
Make sure that that network of helpful resources and individuals is at least next to you somewhere, so that you
Yeah.
know where to turn and you don't have to be scrambling
Prepared.
at the last moment.
Well, and the whole realm of parenting period is unpredictable. Then we
Yes,
add these other layers of unpredictable systems to parenting, um, and the potential of becoming families this way. And it leaves us often feeling like we have very little control over
mm,
anything. And I think that level of anxiety throughout a long period of time for some waiting families
yes,
builds and accumulates, and it becomes really hard to identify anymore what we can advocate for and what we can ask for and what we can create some amount of, maybe not certainty, but clarity around
yes.
ahead of time. And so empowering people to ask the right questions throughout the journey, and not feeling like this has been done to them without their consent, or feeling like we were really well informed or we knew what we were getting into. Wherever possible, ask the clarifying questions ahead of time.
Exactly, and not to put it in terribly simplistic terms, but when we're looking for any major change in our life, we tend to do the deep
That's
research,
right.
right? We
Yeah.
go to Consumer
Yeah.
Reports, or we go here, we go there.
Yeah.
We do that deep research. It should not be any different or laden with any kind of judgment in particular when it comes to creating or expanding a family.
Amazing. I'm going to link in all the resources from your agency into the show notes, because I'd love families to follow up and find out more about how, if they are in Canada or the US, looking for adoption perspectives across the country around how do I envelop a foster child into our home, um, what role your agency might play actually in helping facilitate that. I'm so encouraged by the numbers that you shared, and
Mm,
that I read a bit about in your introduction too. Just uh, the amount of efforts and resources that have been put in to do this in a quality way. And I
yes.
would love
Yeah.
people to make use of that and not feel that they have to go this alone. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much,
Absolutely.
Rita.
It is my pleasure,
Yeah.
and we're delighted to continue to answer questions that anyone has,
Yeah.
and just appreciate the time with you today to talk about this.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, you too.
I just want to encourage you, if you are planning to adopt or early in the process of having adopted and you are in a couple relationships, so you're co parenting, and without going into all the details here, I just wanted to encourage you to check out the show notes. There is a link there to a course that I've created specifically with you in mind. It's called Adoption What to Do While You Wait. And it is 10 modules that are adoption specific, but also couple relationship specific. It helps you walk through conflict resolution skills, concept of how to have really strong positive regard for one another, how to be attuned to needs both for each other and to balance parenthood and also toward your children and what their complex needs might be. So if you are in that boat and curious for more information, click on the link in the show notes and check it out. I know from experience that those things that we cover in that course really do matter for the health and well-being of your family going forward. And we just want to give you the best chance for permanency, for success, for connection, for thriving at the end of the day, with every part of your adoption triad in mind.